The ladder lay precisely where it had fallen, half hidden in the damp, sprawling grass beneath the oldest tree in Trevithick's orchard. To the village constable, it was merely the tragic instrument of a fatal slip, a piece of old wood that had finally given way under a heavy man. But there, near the splintered break of the left stile, the wood told a different story. Against the grey, weathered grain, the fresh cuts were shockingly pale. They were clean, deliberate bites from a fine-toothed saw, angled upward with a quiet, lethal precision. It was not a ladder that had failed, it was a ladder that had been waiting. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Pages. I'm Jack, here in Ohio, a place where we know a thing or two about apple harvests and the stubbornness of old farming families. Today, we're traveling to a fictional village on the border of Worcestershire and Herefordshire, to an orchard where the apples have names older than the trees themselves, and where a family's roots might just be tangled enough to strangle one of their own. Tell me in the comments, have you ever known someone so tied to a piece of land they couldn't see anything else? Get comfortable, pour yourself something warm, and let's begin. This is the Orchard Ladder. Chapter 1, Foxwhelp. Miss Jane Marple's journey into Ashcombe Parva that morning had been a lesson in geography and time. The taxi from the station had labored up a deeply rutted lane, the high, moss-dampened stone walls on either side seeming to press inward as if reluctant to admit a stranger. It was a village that had turned its back on the modern world, nestling into a fold of the Worcestershire hills where the autumn air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The afternoon light, pale and October crisp, slanted low across the southern slope, illuminating the sprawling tangle of Trevithick's orchard. The gnarled, twisting branches of the apple tree seemed to glow with a bruised, golden vitality against the encroaching shadows. Now, she sat in the bay window of Mrs. Paget's sitting room, her knitting needles clicking in a steady, silver rhythm that seemed to measure out the quiet heartbeat of the afternoon. Ashcombe Parva was precisely the sort of village Miss Marple understood perfectly. It was a place of steep, winding lanes that turned back upon themselves like forgetful thoughts, and a current of gossip that flowed as reliably, and often as murkily, as the stream at the bottom of the high street. The sitting room itself was a haven against the chill, smelling faintly of lavender polish and burning logs. A grandfather clock ticked with ponderous self-importance in the corner, while the fire popped cheerfully in the grate. Of course, Edmund Crale is his own worst enemy, Mrs. Paget was saying, her plump hands busy with the silver tea service. She poured a second cup of Earl Grey with the breathless, dramatic momentum she brought to all conversation, whether discussing murder or marmalade. I've told him a dozen times, Jane. I've said, Edmund, you must look to the future. But he simply won't listen. It's that Foxwhelp apple they grow down there are sharp, stubborn, unforgiving things. I've always believed it gets into the blood if you live among them long enough. Miss Marple murmured something suitably agreeable and turned her pale blue eyes toward the window. Beyond the glass, the autumn afternoon was turning a bruised, violet color, the light thickening as the sun dipped behind the hills. Trevithick's orchard covered the entire southern slope of the village, a dense, brooding patch of twisted, moss-hung trees that had belonged to Edmund Crale's late wife, Mary. Even from this distance, the orchard seemed to hold itself apart from the village, wrapped in its own damp, earthy silence. They say the council will force it through regardless, Mrs. Paget continued, offering a plate of exceedingly thin biscuits with a little sigh. The Colton Mill Road scheme, you know. A compulsory purchase order. Such ugly, bureaucratic words, aren't they? They sound so terribly modern and unfeeling. but Edmund acts as though he can simply ignore it. "I won't sign," he told the vicar only last Thursday. He stood right there by the lich gate and said it. As if not signing a piece of paper could stop a bulldozer. The council wants a bypass, and a bypass they shall have. "A sentimental man, perhaps," Miss Marple observed gently, picking up a biscuit and examining its crisp edge. "Sentimental? Oh, devoted to her memory, certainly. Mary has been dead for 5 years, but to hear Edmund speak, she merely went out to the shops and might return at any moment. But it makes things terribly hard on poor Dorothea. She's his sister, you know. She came back from Cheltenham last spring, after that tea-room of hers went under." Mrs. Paget lowered her voice, as though the council itself might be eavesdropping. "A practical woman, Dorothea. Very sensible shoes, very firm opinions. Too practical for a tea-room, perhaps. You need a bit of fluff and nonsense for a tea-room, don't you think? Pink icing and a certain lightness of spirit. Dorothea hasn't a light spirit. And when exactly did she return from Cheltenham?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational as she unspooled a length of pale blue yarn. It must have been a difficult adjustment, returning to a rural life after managing a business in a bustling town. "Oh, it was late March, I believe. Or perhaps early April," Mrs. Paget replied, leaning in conspiratorially. "She arrived with very little luggage and a great deal of grim determination. She took over the household accounts immediately. Edmund used to keep his receipts in a biscuit tin, but Dorothea bought a ledger on her very first day back and insisted every penny be documented." Mrs. Paget paused, frowning slightly as she selected a biscuit for herself. "She corrected me yesterday at the Women's Institute meeting about the date of the jumble sale. I had merely said the 14th, quite casually. Not the 14th, Mrs. Paget. The 15th, she said, looking right through me. One must be exact, or everything falls to pieces. So terribly irritating. But one pities her, living in that draughty old farmhouse with Edmund constantly mooning over his apple trees and refusing to face facts." Miss Marple smiled, letting the rhythm of village life wash over her. "A stubborn, sentimental man, a fiercely practical sister ruined by business, and a piece of land caught awkwardly between the ghosts of the past and the cold machinery of the future." The fire hissed in the grate, but Miss Marple felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the autumn draft. There was no sign of trouble yet, only the quiet, musky tension of a family at odds with the world, and perhaps, more dangerously, with each other. A tension that felt, to Miss Marple's sensitive antennae, distinctly Foxwhelp. Sharp. Stubborn. Unforgiving. Chapter 2, Bittersweet. The news arrived with the morning milk, clinking loudly against the doorstep. It was Tuesday, and a heavy, damp fog clung to the hollows of Ashcombe Parva, turning the familiar cottages into grey, indistinct shapes. Miss Marple had just finished her morning tea when Mrs. Paget hurried into the room, her face pale, her usual breathless momentum entirely gone. Edmund Crale was dead. He had gone out early, before the mist had even begun to lift from the grass, intending to check the high branches of the bittersweet apples at the far end of the orchard. A slip, a fall, a broken neck. Silas Vant, the sullen, slow-moving farmhand who lived in a cottage near the village green, had found him lying beneath the oldest tree. Vant had run all the way to the police station, gasping out a tale of a neck twisted at an impossible angle, and the heavy wooden ladder lying on the ground. Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Paget to the Crale house later that morning, bearing a sensible cold ham, the universal, unspoken village currency of condolence. The Crale farmhouse was a solid, uncompromising building of grey stone, smelling faintly of wood rot and baking apples. Dorothea Crale received them in the front parlour, a room that felt as though it had not been properly heated in a decade. A pervasive, bone-deep chill hung in the air, smelling sharply of beeswax, damp plaster, and the faint, sweet decay of windfall apples drifting in from the orchard. The furniture, heavy, dark mahogany pieces that seemed designed to enforce good posture rather than offer comfort, squatted squarely on a faded Persian rug. The curtains were drawn back precisely to let in the weak grey light, emphasizing the austere perfection of the room. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s, handsome in an angular, unyielding sort of way. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a plain, dark grey dress that seemed to have been selected precisely for its lack of ornament. Her grief was evident, there were dark smudges beneath her eyes, but it was a dry, organized sort of grief. Every movement was controlled, every word was measured. "It is very kind of you to come, Mrs. Paget." "Miss Marple," Dorothea said, accepting the ham with a firm, brisk nod. Her voice was clipped, every consonant precisely articulated, cutting through the heavy air of the room. "Please, sit down. I have asked the girl to make tea." "My dear Dorothea, we are so terribly sorry," Mrs. Paget fluttered, settling onto a stiff horsehair sofa. "Such a dreadful, dreadful shock. To think of him out there, in the cold." "It was the old ladder," Dorothea said, cutting off the sympathy with a sharp gesture. She walked over to the side table and adjusted a lace doily, centering a small, slightly chipped china shepherdess with exact precision. "I had told him to buy an aluminum one. I told him only last week. He refused, of course. He said the old wood flexed with the tree." She frowned at the shepherdess. "That's not quite right. He said it breathed with the tree." "Utter nonsense, of course. Wood does not breathe. Wood rots. And now this." "It must have been a terrible shock," Miss Marple murmured softly. "Had he gone out earlier than usual?" "Not at all. Edmund was a creature of maddening habit," Dorothea replied, her voice clipped. "He always went out precisely at 6:30, always before breakfast, regardless of the weather. He always took that exact ladder because he claimed it was the only one tall enough, and he always checked the bittersweet trees at the southern edge first. Every single morning, like a clockwork toy. A completely predictable routine. I told him it was foolish to stretch for the high branches while the dew was still so heavy, but he never listened." Sergeant Hedges, a large, comfortable man who looked as though he belonged behind a plough rather than a police desk, was standing by the fireplace, drinking tea from a delicate cup that looked absurdly small in his massive hand. He shifted his weight, his leather boots creaking loudly in the quiet room. "Tragic accident, Mrs. Paget," the sergeant rumbled, offering a sympathetic, somewhat bovine nod. "In my experience, you get these things during harvest time. It's the dew, you see. Heavy dew, old wood, a man losing his balance while stretching for fruit. It only takes a moment's inattention. The ground is hard down there. Nothing to be done." Miss Marple sat quietly in a wingback chair, watching Dorothea. The sister's eyes were certainly red, but her hands, pouring the tea that the maid had just brought in, were entirely steady. There was no rattle of the cup against the saucer. She was dealing with the tea things with a capable, almost relentless efficiency. It was a bittersweet moment, the outward show of polite, sorrowful reception covering a reality that Miss Marple found suddenly, chillingly opaque. There was no wildness here. No untidy edge of shock, none of the disjointed rambling that usually accompanied sudden bereavement. "And the orchard?" Mrs. Paget asked, leaning forward, perhaps a little too eagerly for the occasion. "With the compulsory purchase order pending, what will happen now?" "The estate will be sorted in due time, Mrs. Paget," Dorothea said smoothly, handing her a cup. Her face gave nothing away. "My brother was the registered owner, and he left no will that I am aware of. I suppose I shall have to deal with the solicitors now. Someone must manage these things. One cannot simply let matters drift." Miss Marple took her cup and took a slow sip. It was strong, impeccably brewed, and entirely bitter. Chapter 3: Sops in Wine. The inquest was held 3 days later in the village hall, a draughty, echoing room that smelled permanently of floor wax, damp wool, and old hymn books. The coroner, a brisk, irritable man from Gloucester named Mr. Pendennis, seemed determined to hurry through the proceedings so he might catch an early train back to the city. The village, however, had turned out in force, filling the hard wooden chairs, their murmurs creating a low, restless hum beneath the high ceiling. It was here, amidst the rustling of coats and the scraping of chair legs, that Miss Marple felt the first real prickle of unease. The apple variety sops in wine, Mrs. Paget had explained the day before over a plate of scones, was an old cider apple with flesh stained red as blood. Traditionally, it was used in wassailing ceremonies to bless the orchard, soaked in cider and left in the branches to appease the tree spirits. A festive thing on the outside, certainly, but with a dark, unsettling interior. The first ripple in the smooth, polished surface of the accidents and theory came when Silas Vant took the stand to give his testimony. The farmhand looked profoundly uncomfortable in a tight, outdated suit. He mumbled his oath, looking everywhere but at the coroner, his large, calloused hands twisting his flat cap into a tight roll. "Now, Mr. Vant, speak up, if you please," Mr. Pendennis said sharply, adjusting his spectacles. "You found the deceased at approximately 6:30 in the morning. Describe the scene." "He were just laying there, sir," Silas muttered, staring at the floorboards. "Under the old Bittersweet. Awful quiet, he was. I knew right off he was gone. His head was, it wasn't right." "And the ladder?" "The means of his fall," the coroner pressed. "It was on the grass. Broke, it was." Silas shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the back of the hall where Dorothea sat, rigid as a statue. Miss Marple noted how quickly he glossed over the state of the ladder, how his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. He was hiding something, she was sure of it, though whether it was guilt or merely fear of authority, she could not yet tell. Then came a new figure, causing a wave of muttering to ripple through the audience. Owen Burley. He was a property developer from Birmingham, and he looked entirely out of place in Ashcombe Parva. He wore a suit that was a little too sharp, a little too blue, and a silk tie that caught the weak light pouring through the high windows too aggressively. He stood in the witness box with his chest puffed out, radiating an air of defensive belligerence. "I made Mr. Crale a very fair offer," Burley told the coroner, practically shouting to be heard over the village murmur. 6 months ago, I approached him. For housing. Good, modern housing, which this village desperately needs. He wouldn't hear of it. He told me to get off his land and threatened me with a shotgun. A shotgun? Mr. Pendennis asked, his eyebrows rising. Metaphorically speaking, sir, Burley amended hastily. But he was hostile. Very hostile. And the compulsory purchase order currently pending on the land, the coroner asked, leaning forward. Did that alter your negotiations? The council's doing, that is, not mine, Burley said quickly. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought, noting the sudden sheen of sweat on his forehead. Though I stood to win the contract if the land was cleared. I won't lie about that to this court. It's business. But he had until the end of the month, 6-week statutory deadline, you know, to contest the order. Any fool would have contested it to get a better price, but he was a fool not to. The village murmured louder. Mrs. Paget leaned over and whispered into Miss Marple's ear, 6 weeks. My word. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting forgotten in her lap. 6 weeks. A statutory deadline. Edmund Crale had stubbornly refused to sell, refused even to contest the order, effectively condemning the land to be seized for a pittance. And now, suddenly, he was gone, and the deadline was looming ominously close. If he died before the deadline, ownership would pass, and the new owner could contest it, could negotiate, could save themselves from financial ruin. After the coroner delivered a swift verdict of accidental death, Miss Marple walked slowly back to Mrs. Paget's cottage, leaning heavily on her walking stick. The surface of the tragedy was beginning to look very different. The polite veneer of an accident was cracking, and beneath it, the blood-red reality was seeping through. Chapter 4: Slack-ma-Girdle. Miss Marple did not announce her intention to visit Trevithick's orchard. She simply took her walking stick, wrapped a thick wool scarf around her neck against the damp chill, and set out after luncheon, telling Mrs. Paget only that she wished to take the air. The orchard was vast and silent, the trees heavy with unpicked fruit that dropped with soft, dull thuds into the long grass. The smell of cider and decay hung thickly in the air. She found the spot easily enough at the far southern edge. The grass was still violently flattened where the body had lain, and the earth was churned by heavy police boots. And there, pushed carelessly against the dry stone wall by Sergeant Hedges' men, was the ladder. It was an old wooden thing, heavy and weathered, covered in pale green lichen. Miss Marple approached it cautiously, adjusting her spectacles and leaning closer, careful not to disturb the ground around it. She did not touch it, but she didn't need to. Her eyesight, when it mattered, was remarkably sharp. There, on the left stile, just above the third rung, the wood had snapped. But it had not simply snapped under weight. Beneath the ragged, splintered edge of the break, Miss Marple saw the distinct, pale lines of saw cuts. They were fresh, exposing the bright, unweathered wood beneath. They had been made carefully, biting into the stile from the underside, cutting just enough to weaken the structural integrity, but not enough to be visible to a man casually carrying or climbing it. The ladder had not failed. It had been rigged to fail under the weight of a grown man reaching for the high branches. She straightened up, her expression mild but her pale blue eyes flinty. A Slack-ma-Girdle apple, she recalled, an old Devonshire variety known for loosening bonds, for slipping the belt. The hidden trap. Someone had set a trap for Edmund Crale, calculating that his stubborn routine would lead him right into it. As she turned back toward the muddy lane, a sudden rustling in the undergrowth made her freeze. Silas Vant emerged from behind a massive, gnarled oak, a half-empty canvas sack of apples slung over his shoulder. He stopped dead when he saw her, his face draining of color. He looked absolutely terrified, his large hands trembling. "I didn't do it," he blurted out, his voice cracking, before she had even spoken a word. "Didn't do what, exactly, Mr. Vant?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly, gripping her walking stick a fraction tighter. "Whatever they're going to say about me. Whatever the police think." Silas took a step backward, his eyes wide. "He owed me wages. 3 weeks' worth. I'm not denying I was angry. I complained down the pub, everyone heard me. But I wouldn't touch the ladder. I swear on my mother's grave." "You seem very sure the ladder was touched," Miss Marple observed quietly. Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "I saw it. Before the police moved it. I saw the marks. But I didn't say nothing. If I said something, they'd blame me, wouldn't they? The unpaid hand. But I didn't do it. I only came back today to take what I'm owed in fruit." He turned and bolted, stumbling over the uneven ground, dropping 3 red apples in his frantic haste to escape. Miss Marple watched him go, listening to the heavy thud of his boots fade into the distance. Silas Vant had a grievance, certainly, and he was a thief. But a man who stole apples in broad daylight to settle a debt, and who panicked so completely at the sight of an old lady with a walking stick, did not strike her as a man with the cold, calculating nerve required for premeditated murder. Chapter 5: Bloody Ploughman. The news of the saw cuts broke the next morning, sweeping through Ashcombe Parva like a brushfire. A sharp-eyed constable, sent to retrieve the ladder for disposal, had noticed what Miss Marple had already seen. Sergeant Hedges was forced, with great reluctance and a heavy sigh, to upgrade the tragedy to a formal murder investigation. The village was electrified, a mix of horror and undeniable thrill buzzing through the post office and the butcher's shop. The local legend of the bloody Ploughman apple, the tale of a thief shot dead by a gamekeeper for stealing fruit, whose grieving wife grew a blood-red tree from the stolen apples in his pockets, was whispered over garden fences. Violence, sudden and deliberate, had come to the ordinary, rhythmic labor of Ashcombe Parva. Miss Marple found herself taking tea once again with Dorothea Crale, under the polite pretext of returning a glass dish that had contained the cold ham. The atmosphere in the farmhouse had changed. The quiet grief had been replaced by a bristling, defensive energy. Dorothea was dressed in severe, uncompromising black, sitting at the large oak dining table, systematically sorting through a massive cardboard box of Edmund's papers. Ledgers, letters, and council documents were arranged in perfect, geometrical piles. "It is quite intolerable, Miss Marple," Dorothea said, her voice sharp and brittle as breaking glass. She did not stop sorting as she spoke. "The police rummaging through everything. Tramping mud into the hall. They have taken Silas Vant in for formal questioning, you know. The man is a fool, of course. He's been stealing small amounts from the petty cash for months. I told Edmund repeatedly, but Edmund wouldn't sack him. He had a weak spot for a sob story." "How very distressing for you," Miss Marple said sympathetically, accepting a cup of tea. "To have such an intrusion at a time of mourning." And Mr. Burley? The developer from Birmingham? The village is saying the police are looking very closely at him. A vulgar man in a cheap suit, Dorothea sniffed, dismissing him entirely. Edmund should have dealt with him firmly from the start. Instead, he simply ignored him. She picked up a thick, legal-looking letter, glanced at the date, and placed it in a neat pile to her left. That was Edmund's great failing. He simply didn't understand the law, and he refused to learn. He thought if he ignored the council's purchase order, they would eventually go away and leave him in peace. I had to explain to him that the law doesn't care about sentiment. I had to tell him that only the registered owner can legally contest a compulsory purchase order or negotiate the compensation. Miss Marple paused, her teacup hovering halfway to her lips. She looked at the perfectly arranged piles of paper. You explained the legal intricacies to him, my dear. Yes. Last week. I felt it was my duty. Dorothea made a tiny, microscopic adjustment to the pile of letters, aligning the edges perfectly. That's not quite right. It was 2 weeks ago. On a Tuesday. I spoke to a solicitor in Colton on his behalf to understand our position. Edmund was absolutely furious that I had interfered. He told me to pack my bags. But I was only trying to save us. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, taking a small sip of tea. A small, precise correction of the timeline. A highly practical woman sorting financial papers while her brother was barely cold in the ground. The grief was organized. Purposeful. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp beneath their mild exterior, drifted over the stacks on the table. The pile immediately to Dorothea's left was composed entirely of legal correspondence, the thick cream paper bearing the distinctive letterhead of Messrs. Cavers and Croft, solicitors. She noted, with a small internal flicker of confirmation, that the top letter was dated mere days ago, well before Edmund's unfortunate accident. Even upside down, the words "a registered owner" and "statutory period" stood out clearly in the formal type. She had the letters ready, Miss Marple thought to herself, feeling a cold certainty settle in her chest. She was not merely sorting his estate, she was preparing for an eventuality she knew was imminent. She had sought the legal standing she needed, and when he would not grant it in life, she had found a way to take it in death. Dorothea wasn't mourning the past, she was actively managing the future. And Miss Marple knew from long experience that people who meticulously managed the future were often capable of removing any obstacles that stood in their way. Chapter 6: Knotted Kernel. The knotted kernel is a curious apple. It possesses a tough, tangled core, famously difficult to press, but it is known for surviving long periods of exile and harsh conditions where softer varieties perish. Miss Marple felt the police investigation had reached its own stubbornly knotted core, a tangle of motives and alibis that refused to yield to Sergeant Hedges' straightforward, heavy-handed approach. She sat comfortably by Mrs. Paget's fire, her knitting needles clicking, listening to the rain beat against the glass in sudden, violent gusts. "I say it's Owen Burley," Mrs. Paget declared, jabbing a steel knitting needle in the air for emphasis. "The man positively reeks of desperation and cheap cologne. He has a motive, Jane. Clear as day. And I heard from Mrs. Higgins at the post office, who has a cousin in the Birmingham constabulary, that he has a prior conviction for fraud. Dodgy building contracts. He's exactly the sort of villain to sneak about in the dark and cut a ladder." Miss Marple shook her head slowly, pausing to count her stitches. "I don't think so, my dear. Mr. Burley is a businessman, and not a particularly clever one. He wants the land cleared for houses, yes. But if Edmund Crale is murdered, the land passes to his sister, Dorothea. Dorothea might well contest the council's order, or she might sell it to a rival developer entirely. Murdering Mr. Crale introduces chaos and legal delays. Probate can take years. Businessmen of Mr. Burley's type dislike chaos, they prefer a sure thing. His easiest path was to let the council take the land and then bid for the building contract. Then it must be Silas Vant, Mrs. Paget insisted, refusing to surrender the thrill of a local suspect. The unpaid wages. The brooding resentment. Everyone knows he has a temper when he's had a few pints. A man who steals petty cash and drops his apples in terror at the sight of an old lady does not plan a cold-blooded murder with a saw, Miss Marple murmured, smoothing the wool over her knee. Murder requires a certain intellectual commitment. Silas Vant is a man of impulse, not calculation. She paused, her mind drifting back, as it so often did, to the village of St. Mary Mead, where human nature was perfectly encapsulated in miniature. You know, this situation reminds me very much of the Elkins family back home. Did I ever tell you about George and Letitia Elkins? A brother and sister who lived in a very nice, double-fronted house near the church. They quarreled terribly over a garden wall that separated their property from the lane. Mr. Elkins was a deeply sentimental man, very attached to his prize-winning climbing roses, which covered the old brickwork. He spent hours pruning them, talking to them, treating them like children. Miss Elkins, however, was extremely practical. She had just purchased a new, rather large motor car, and she wanted to widen the drive. The wall, she pointed out, made the turn impossibly tight. They argued about it for months. Everyone in the village thought it was just a silly squabble, the sort of bickering siblings do to pass the time. Mr. Elkins flatly refused to let a single brick be moved. Miss Elkins kept bringing in surveyors with measuring tapes. Then, one very windy autumn night, a terrible crash woke the neighbors. The wall had simply collapsed, crushing Mr. Elkins' beautiful rosebushes entirely. Miss Elkins told the insurance assessor it was frost damage combined with the gale. Mrs. Paget stopped her knitting, leaning forward with wide eyes. Good heavens, Jane! And was it the wind? Oh, no, my dear, Miss Marple said softly, a shadow of sadness crossing her face. It was Miss Elkins, with a very heavy sledge-hammer, in the middle of the night. The butcher's boy saw her brushing brick dust off her dressing gown the next morning. You see, she didn't do it out of malice toward her brother. She didn't hate the roses. She simply needed the drive widened, and the wall was in her way. She couldn't understand why everyone made such a terrible fuss about a few crushed flowers when the practical necessity was so obvious. Chapter 7, Stoke Red. The Stoke Red apple was once known by local farmers as a never blight. It is a stubborn, defiant fruit, resistant to scab and rot, holding firm to the branch long after the other apples have fallen. It was the favorite apple of Edmund Crale, the man who would not yield to the council, the developer, or his own sister. Sergeant Hedges' investigation, much like the Stoke Red, was hitting a wall of stubborn resistance. He had formally cleared Silas Vant, though not without a great deal of blustering. Miss Marple happened to be at the grocer's when the sergeant explained the matter to the shopkeeper. Silas, it turned out, had an ironclad, unshakable alibi for the afternoon and evening the ladder must have been tampered with. He had been drinking heavily in the public bar of the Red Lion, in full view of the publican and a dozen regular patrons, complaining bitterly about his missing wages from 4 o'clock until closing time. Furthermore, the sawdust found clinging to Silas's only saw was from green pine, not seasoned apple wood. Owen Burley, too, was quietly and reluctantly dropped from the suspect list. Miss Marple learned this detail from the vicar's wife, who had heard it from the police station cleaner. Burley had left Ashcombe Parva in a foul temper the day before the murder. His flashy car had broken down spectacularly in the centre of Gloucester that evening, and the AA mechanic, along with the manager of the hotel where Burley was forced to stay, vouched for his presence 50 miles away during the critical window of time. With the outsider and the disgruntled employee eliminated, the focus of the village gossip, and of Sergeant Hedges' slow-moving, methodical investigation, turned inward. But there was no proof. There were no muddy boots found in the farmhouse, no bloody hands, no saw hidden under floorboards with sawdust matching the ladder's break. There was only a grieving sister with a perfect, unbreakable alibi. On the night before the murder, Dorothea Crale had been playing bridge with Mrs. Paget, the doctor's wife, and the vicar's sister in the vicarage parlour until well past midnight. She had not left the room once. A perfect alibi, Miss Marple thought, looking out through the rain-streaked window toward the distant, grey blur of the orchard. And yet, in my experience, alibis that are too perfect, too aggressively public, are often the very things that require the closest examination. Chapter 8, Yarlington Mill. Miss Marple realized she needed to understand the precise, grinding mechanics of the law that had trapped the Crale family. The law, she knew, was a machine, and murder was often the result of someone trying to stop the gears from turning. She arranged to meet Reverend Moss at the church that afternoon, under the perfectly plausible pretext of discussing the upcoming flower-arranging rota for the Harvest Festival. The Yarlington Mill apple, famously discovered growing tenaciously from a stone wall near a mill in Somerset, spoke of the relentless grinding of machinery, of fate, and of harsh survival in unforgiving places. Edmund was a terribly difficult man to help, Miss Marple, the Reverend sighed. They were standing near the cold stone of the baptismal font, the church echoing with the sound of the rain on the lead roof. He looked tired, the weight of his parishioners' tragedies pulling at his shoulders. His wife, Mary, loved that orchard more than life itself. It was her family's land. When she was dying, she made Edmund swear a solemn oath never to sell it. Never to let it go to strangers. It became a sacred trust to him, a monument to her memory. And the compulsory purchase order for the new bypass? Miss Marple asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It broke his heart when the notice arrived, the Reverend said softly. But his stubbornness blinded him to reality. He believed that if he just stood firm, if he simply refused to acknowledge their letters, they couldn't take it. He wouldn't sign anything. He wouldn't even hire a solicitor to negotiate the compensation they were offering. He thought right was on his side, and that would be enough. But the deadline was approaching, was it not? Miss Marple noted, her voice carefully neutral. Yes. Next week, in fact. If he didn't formally contest the order by the deadline, the council would seize it at agricultural value. Worthless, essentially. Dorothea tried to make him see reason. She was frantic about it. I've never seen a woman so distraught. Distraught because of her debts, I presume, Miss Marple said quietly. The Reverend looked startled, blinking rapidly in the dim light. Good heavens, how did you know? Yes. The tea room in Cheltenham was a disaster. She owed a great deal of money to creditors there. They were threatening bankruptcy. The compensation from the council, if properly negotiated for commercial development rather than agricultural land, could have saved her completely. She would have inherited half the money. But the law is clear, only the registered owner could negotiate. And Edmund point-blank refused to speak to a lawyer. Miss Marple thanked the Reverend for his time and walked slowly out into the damp, mossy churchyard. It was all there, laid out as clearly as a blueprint. The mechanism of the trap. The practical, unsentimental woman facing total financial and social ruin, blocked by the unyielding, romantic stubbornness of her brother. She paused by an old, weathered headstone, her thoughts turning once more to St. Mary Mead. It is a terrible thing when practical people are pushed into a corner, she said softly to herself. I remember Mrs. Bantry's cousin, a woman who lived just past the post office. She was a very capable, sensible woman. When her husband passed away suddenly, everyone marveled at how practical she was about her grief. She didn't weep or wail. She immediately ordered the mourning clothes, arranged the catering, and settled the estate within a week. Everyone praised her fortitude. But her practicality, you see, meant something different from what it usually does. It wasn't resilience. It meant she had arranged the grief beforehand. She had purchased the mourning dress a month before he took ill, because she knew exactly when the poison she was putting in his tea would finish the job. She couldn't abide mess, and she needed the insurance money to pay off her own secret debts. Practicality, when divorced from morality, is a very dangerous thing indeed. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and began the slow walk back down the lane. As she passed the heavy iron gate leading into Trevithick's orchard, she paused, her gaze drawn upward past the gnarled branches to the grey stone facade of the Crale farmhouse. There, behind the slightly wavy glass of a first-floor window, stood Dorothea Crale. She was perfectly still, a dark silhouette against the unlit room behind her, watching Miss Marple's progress with an unblinking, avian intensity. The distance between them was too great for any expression to be legible, yet Miss Marple felt the weight of that stare settling over her like a shroud. For a long, silent moment, their eyes met across the expanse of damp grass and decaying fruit. Then, with the smooth, measured movement of someone closing a ledger, Dorothea stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from the glass. It was an ominous, unsettling visual, the quiet watcher at the window, guarding her secrets behind the thick walls of her practicality. Chapter 9: Kingston Black. The Kingston Black is widely considered the absolute king of cider apples. It produces a juice that is flawless in its balance of tannin, acid, and sugar. But it is a notoriously difficult tree to cultivate. It is fragile, prone to canker and scab, demanding a high cost in labor and heartbreak for the perfection it yields. Miss Marple found Dorothea Crale deep in the orchard late the following afternoon. The fog was rolling in again off the hills, thick and white, turning the ancient apple trees into grey, grasping shapes that seemed to close in around them. Dorothea was standing very still near the broken ladder, which the police had finally released and left leaning haphazardly against a trunk. She wore a heavy tweed coat against the biting chill, her face pale and sharp in the dimming light. She was staring at the splintered wood, entirely absorbed in her own thoughts. "It is a beautiful place, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, stepping softly over the damp, yielding grass so as not to startle the younger woman. There is a deep, quiet peace here, if one knows how to listen for it. Dorothea did not jump. She turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. It is an albatross, Miss Marple. It is a suffocating weight. My brother let it consume him entirely. He cared more for these rotting roots than he did for the living world. And it very nearly consumed you as well, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, stopping a few paces away, leaning on her stick. Dorothea's eyes narrowed, two dark slits in her pale face. I don't know what you mean. I am simply trying to sort out the mess he left behind. I think you know exactly what I mean, Miss Marple replied, her voice remaining soft, conversational, yet holding a steely undercurrent. You are a very practical woman, Dorothea. You have a head for business, for dates, for exactness. You saw the council's deadline approaching. The 6 statutory weeks. If Edmund did nothing, and you knew he intended to do nothing, the land would be taken for agricultural pennies. Your debts in Cheltenham would ruin you. You would face bankruptcy, the loss of your reputation, the loss of your home. Edmund was a fool, Dorothea spat, the facade cracking just a fraction to reveal the boiling anger beneath. He lived in a fantasy where Mary was still alive and looking out the kitchen window. You went to the solicitor in Colton to learn the exact position of the law, Miss Marple continued inexorably. But Edmund wouldn't listen to your practical advice. He wouldn't sign. He wouldn't negotiate. He was perfectly content to lose everything for the sake of his sentiment. Dorothea stood very still, her hands thrust deep into the pockets of her tweed coat, her knuckles showing white through the fabric. The fog swirled between them. You had an alibi for the night before the murder, of course, Miss Marple said, adjusting her scarf. A very public, very solid alibi. You played bridge with Mrs. Paget and the vicar's sister until midnight. You made sure you were seen, that your presence was noted. But the trap wasn't set that night, was it? That was merely the distraction. Dorothea said nothing. I spoke to Silas Vantaghen this morning, Miss Marple said. He told me he brought the heavy wooden ladder out from the barn 2 days before the accident, at Edmund's request. It sat right here, leaning against the wall, waiting. You didn't need to sneak out in the dead of night. You could have cut it at any time in the afternoon, while Silas was in the fields and Edmund was at the market in the village. A few strokes of a fine-toothed saw from underneath the stile. Very precise. Very clean. Not enough to break it immediately, but enough to ensure it would snap when a heavy man climbed to the 3rd rung. You have no proof of this, Dorothea said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the voice of a woman reciting a legal defense. The police have found no saw. They have found nothing tying me to this ridiculous theory. No forensic proof, perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, shaking her head sadly. The police must rely on physical evidence, and you are far too clever to leave the saw where it could be found. It is likely at the bottom of the mill pond by now. But I know people, my dear. I understand human nature. Miss Marple took a step closer, looking directly into Dorothea's eyes. I knew a woman once in my village who loved a piece of land more than her own kin. She couldn't see the horror of what she was doing when she removed her husband from the equation. She only saw the logic of it. The absolute, unbending necessity. You didn't hate Edmund, did you? You weren't driven by a sudden, blinding rage. You just needed him to be out of the way before the deadline expired. You needed to inherit the title so you could sign the papers, negotiate the compensation, and save yourself from ruin. It was a business decision. Dorothea looked away, staring into the dark, twisted heart of the Kingston black trees. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the orchard was the slow, steady drip of moisture from the dying leaves onto the grass below. The silence seemed to stretch to the breaking point. When she finally spoke, her voice broke, just a little. A small, precise crack in the perfect armor. He wouldn't listen, she whispered, her hands shaking as she pulled them from her pockets. I sat him down at the table. I laid out the ledgers. I told him, Edmund, they will take it all. They will pave over Mary's orchard, and they will give us nothing for it, and we will be out on the street. And he just smiled. He smiled that infuriating, peaceful, empty smile and said Mary wouldn't allow it to happen. Mary was dead. For 5 years, dead in the ground. We were alive. We had to live. I had to live. She closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a line down her cheek, quickly wiped away with the back of a trembling hand. I didn't want him to suffer, Miss Marple. Truly, I didn't. I measured the height. I angled the cut so the fall would happen backward, quickly. I wanted a clean break. I thought he would just snap his neck and it would be over before he knew what happened. Miss Marple felt a profound, heavy wave of sadness wash over her. It was always the same. The terrible, ruthless logic of the desperate. A clean break, Dorothea, she said softly, the sorrow heavy in her voice. But a broken thing, nevertheless. And a broken soul to carry it. Slowly, Miss Marple drew her hand from her pocket, producing a neatly folded white handkerchief. She held it out slightly, a stark contrast to the gloom of the orchard. You see, my dear, when we spoke earlier of proof and alibis, I am afraid the matter is no longer solely in my hands. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, devoid of triumph. Sergeant Hedges is standing just there, by the lane gate. He has been standing there for the last 5 minutes. He heard enough. Dorothea went rigid. She turned her head slowly, her gaze following Miss Marple's gesture through the mist. The large, bulky form of the sergeant was clearly visible beside the iron gate, stepping forward from the shadow of the hedgerow. Dorothea saw him. She saw the notebook in his hand. For a moment, Miss Marple expected a denial, a scream, a frantic dash for the house. Instead, Dorothea seemed to absorb this final reality with the same flat, unflinching practicality she had displayed throughout. She offered no dramatic protest. She simply straightened her tweed coat, smoothed down the front, and bent to pick up a single, perfect Kingston black apple that had fallen into the grass. Holding it firmly, she turned her back on her brother's orchard and walked steadily toward the gate. Chapter 10, Egremont Russet. The arrest was handled quietly, with the sort of grim discretion that small villages excel at when faced with true scandal. Sergeant Hedges arrived later that evening in the unmarked police car. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, his large hands awkwardly clutching his uniform cap as he took Dorothea Crale away. There were no sirens, no shouting in the street, no dramatic struggles. just the quiet closing of the heavy oak door of the farmhouse, and the crunch of tires on gravel as they drove away into the night. The Egremont russet is a deceptive apple. It is rough, brown, and plain on the outside, looking more like a potato than a fruit, but it hides a rich, complex, nutty flavor beneath its dull skin. As autumn settled firmly and coldly over Ashcombe Parva, the village began to digest the truth beneath its own plain exterior. The quiet, respectable Crale family had harbored a rot deeper than anyone had guessed. A week later, Miss Marple packed her small valise, preparing to return to the familiar comforts of St. Mary Mead. She stood one last time at the bay window of Mrs. Paget's sitting room, fully dressed for her journey, waiting for the taxi to take her to the station. The compulsory purchase order went through, eventually. With Dorothea awaiting trial in prison and Edmund in the churchyard, the estate was hopelessly tied up in the slow, grinding machinery of probate. The council moved in and formally claimed the land. But, as is so often the case with grand municipal plans, the developers found the ground too marshy, the old tree roots too deep and tangled to easily excavate. The budget swelled, the project stalled, and the bulldozers were moved to another, easier site. The orchard remained, a tangle of old wood and dropping fruit, waiting in the cold rain for whatever would come next. "It's a terrible, terrible shame," Mrs. Paget said, coming up beside Miss Marple and dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Such a respectable family. Her father was the church warden. Who could have known what she was capable of? It makes one shudder to look at one's own neighbors." "Anyone is capable of it, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, watching a single leaf detach itself from a branch and drift down into the mud. "Anyone at all, if they feel the walls closing in tightly enough, and if they value their own practical salvation over a human life." She looked out at the trees, bearing their heavy, bitter harvest in the fading, watery light. The orchard had survived the developers, the council, and the tragic family that had tended it. It would go on growing, silent and indifferent to the human drama that had played out beneath its branches. It seemed to Miss Marple that the story of the Crale family had been written in the very fruit they cultivated. It began with the sharp, stubborn musk of the foxwhelp, rooted deeply in family tension, only to be overtaken by the bittersweet deception that masked a cold-blooded murder. The Sops in wine had offered their red portent, a dark and bloody harvest soaking into the soil, just as the Slack-ma-Girdle's loosened bonds gave way to the fatal drop. She thought of the bloody Ploughman's legacy of violence, the knotted Kernel's tough, unyielding core that refused to break, and the Stoke Red's defiant stand against rot that ultimately failed them. Now, caught in the relentless, grinding machinery of the Yarlington mill, the terrible perfection of Dorothea's dark Kingston black plan had come to its end. And here, beneath the rough, deceptive skin of the Egremont russet, the plain, unvarnished truth was finally exposed for all to see. And there we leave Ashcombe Parva. A tragedy born not of monstrous, cackling evil, but of practical desperation, cold logic, and a deadline ticking down in a solicitor's office. I'd love to hear your thoughts below in the comments. Did Dorothea's brutal logic make a terrible kind of sense to you, given her impending ruin? Or was she simply cold to the core, completely devoid of empathy? This is Jack from Ohio. Thank you for joining me here at Midnight Pages. Old secrets and new ones keep good company together, I think. They both know the value of silence. And they both, in the end, speak. Good night.